So, lots of things we can do to think about avoiding that sort of crowding out. Lots of ways in which you can have a mixture of internal and external collective actions that makes the best of the both worlds. Offering tax advantages for environmental protection work, providing conditional grants to volunteer organisations are just a few examples. But I want to move on to agricultural chemical waste because I think I've spent a lot of time talking about generalities. I want to get to some specifics. So think about what we have with the agricultural chemical waste sector. You do have a top-down regulatory base in this area. Right? You have supply restrictions, the sort of chemicals that are licensed and available. You have use restrictions, right, set up under regulations. You have all sorts of approval processes. You've got to have your ChemCert to be able to purchase and use chemicals. OH&S rules in operation. They're all examples of top-down regulatory approaches. They tend to be really high-cost options, right? But that external collective action is justified because of the very high potential costs of something going seriously wrong with the use of the chemicals. But there are also some wonderful examples in this field of internal collective action. And the one that I'm going to spend a few minutes on now, and the one that Karen will speak of in much greater depth, is the drum muster scheme. Now, I'm not going to talk in detail of this because Karen will do a much better job than I will, but basically drum muster is a scheme to avoid lots and lots of old chemical drums lying around on farms. It's a scheme which involves farmers returning their spent drums to a central repository. It's a voluntary scheme on the part of the chemical suppliers. Okay? Chemical suppliers engage in the scheme by paying a levy, or charging a levy, I should say, to the purchasers of the chemical of 4 cents per litre or per kilogram. So as a chemical supplier, I might say, well, I'm going to engage in the drum master scheme, but it means I'm going to have to charge my purchasers an extra 4 cents a litre. So I'm going to impose a cost on my consumers, on my buyers. Now, what that does, what that 4 cents per litre does, is to provide a kitty which then funds the collection of those spent drums. So you can go along to a country town and go to the local tip and you'll find the drum muster collection point. So that 4 cents a litre basically funds the collection point. Okay. Now, remarkably successful scheme. Karen will go into much more detail about that, I'm sure, but it has worked very well. But think about it in terms of decision making and incentives. First of all, the payment of the levy by the user of the chemical fundamentally results in a lowering of the costs of disposal of the drums for the farmer. Okay, there's a local drop-off point, it's a centralised drop-off point. You don't have to go much further to dispose of the drums. So that provision of the service increases the probability that farmers will bring the drums back for collection and recycling. So what it does by increasing the probability of returning the drum is to provide a public good and a private good. The private good is basically enjoyed by the farmer who gets rid of all the old drums around the farm. So that's something that they enjoy themselves. But it also provides a broader environmental good in terms of aesthetics, in terms of contamination, and in terms of material recycling and reuse. Now that's an interesting phenomenon because what we're seeing is producers volunteering to up the price of the product they're supplying to the market. You don't have to be in this scheme. So you could see this as an opportunity to lower your price and not be part of the scheme. Yet the chemical producers want to be involved. Right? And the farmers, the buyers of the chemicals, can opt for a different chemical, a different supplier, and not be part of the Drum Master program. But they opt to buy the Drum Master chemicals. So there's a voluntary acceptance of these additional costs. Why do people do that? Why do people do that? Well, we've done some studies in an urban context, which does shed some light on this. These are studies whereby we present to people options for waste disposal in an urban setting. And this is basically, if you live in Brisbane, you can have a normal bin, or you can have a normal bin and a recycling bin. Of course, the recycling bin means you have to pay more rates. So we give people options to get rid of the recycling bin and pay lower rates. Which do they prefer? We give them options, choice options, and from those choice options we can see just how much they are willing to pay to be engaged in recycling. And what we find is that the amount they're willing to pay is a significant positive sum. So people are stepping up and saying, yes, we want to be engaged in this recycling process, and the sums involved are not trivial. In fact, they're sufficiently untrivial to cover the costs of running those recycling services. So what that illustrates is, I guess, a willingness for the urban community to be involved in a scheme which will see their waste not only removed, but in that case, recycled. And I think the Drum Master scheme demonstrates a similar willingness on the part of farmers to avoid the waste on their own farms, but also to be engaged in a scheme which will see a reduction in contamination, a fuller use of the resources that are available in the drums themselves. So voluntarism on the part of the farmer, but voluntarism also on the part of the supplying companies. So, in conclusion, Mr. Chairman, yes, agricultural chemical waste is one of these things in economics which we say have collective or public good elements that's going to require some form of collective action. It's not going to happen just with a decentralised market process. And what I'm stressing for you this afternoon, I hope, is that there is an opportunity to use these decentralised, voluntary, internal collective action mechanisms to deal with some of the agricultural chemical waste issues. Some of them, not all of them. That voluntarism, that internal collective action, has significant advantages in terms of being able to lower the transaction costs of the exchange process, and also it enables greater flexibility, enables innovation in the way that these schemes are operating, way beyond those that can be offered in any sort of regulatory top-down approach. And a word of warning here. A scheme which is successful is often seen as something which should be encouraged by government. And we've seen, at least in my experience, some land care groups suffering this fate, whereas successful groups have been, with obvious good intent, flooded with government money and government help. And what that has done is crowded out the effort that volunteer individuals within those land care groups have been willing to put in. They step aside and say, oh, that's okay, we don't need to do that anymore because the department is doing that role for us now. So that crowding out effect is something that really has to be watched. Drum Master, in my opinion, provides a very useful example of that voluntary initiative that is cost-effective and effective in achieving the environmental goals for which it's been established. But what I leave you with is a question, and that question is there anything else we can think of in the ag chemical waste area which perhaps has some potential to move into this internal collective action sphere? Is there some government policy which might be able to lever greater voluntary input, perhaps to limit more the free rider problem that we experience in these collective action issues. So a question for you, is there any way that we might be able to see the drum muster type model being extended further in this realm? And I'll leave you with that question.
Thanks.